So I just want to say welcome again to all of you. And why don't we just make sure everybody's kind of familiar with the technology, and go ahead to the chat area and just put in where you're either currently practicing, your city, your state. I know there are people who are joining from outside of California, and I welcome you guys as well, because this is a topic that I think many states are watching California and what we're doing. Thanks, Shelly. Shelly's coming from Arizona, but you used to be a California girl. You probably still are at heart. Santa Clara, Whittier. Hey, Jen, from Santa Barbara, Long Beach. I'm so excited to see all of you here. And then, are you mostly nurses? And I know there's a few, I just recognize a few doctors' names. So I see Anna. So tell me a little bit. Are you mostly nurses, CNSs, educators? Awesome. That's great. Fantastic. Cool. Well, welcome. Welcome to all of you, nurse managers, physicians, neurologists, neonatologists, nurse practitioners, CNSs. I mean, this topic really does take a team, and I think that that's something that all of us have realized if we've been doing this for a while. So I'll just take a second and introduce myself. So I'm Kathy Randall, and I have been a neonatal nurse since 1994, and I, by accident, got involved, I think, really doing consulting and education and helping neuro NICUs get started around the globe. And it started probably 12 years ago when I was first introduced to amplitude integrated EEG, and I met many of you through that. Some of you I've worked with locally throughout the state, and I am really honored that you would spend time with me today, and especially as it's getting close to the holidays and we're so busy. But I think that this is an important topic, and that's probably why you're here, because I think we're all struggling with really how to implement these new guidelines and whether or not we're doing the best things, you know, as we're kind of moving forward with the implementation of these. And so I was lucky enough to be sitting at the table with some of you as we kind of discussed these guidelines and discussed the need for these guidelines in California, just with our large population and our long distances that we have to travel. And so I don't really practice in any specific unit anymore. I'm more of kind of a global consultant, and really have helped many people around the globe set up neuro NICUs as well as cooling programs from all over. So it looks like one person has their hand raised. Diane, hi, do you want me to unmute you? Do you want to tell me if you have a question that you want me to unmute you? I can do it real quick. Diane, did you have a question? Maybe it was just an accident. I'll go ahead and change you back to an attendee. So let me know if you have a question, Diane. Okay, no worries. All right, well, let me pull up my slides here, and let's get started. Because I know that we are all busy and have so many places to go and places to be, especially this holiday season. Oops, let's see here. Let's see, desktop. I have two desktops going, of course. So let me stop my video. That always helps things. And then we can, I think, more easily show this. Let's see. So tell me, are you seeing, which screen are you seeing? I'm gonna So are you, oh my God, I probably should have joined from my phone. So I could see what you're saying. So Jen, I just made you a panelist. If you can tell me if you're seeing my slides. Just want to make sure. I have too many desktops up today.
Yes, I'm seeing the slides.
The full screen or the one with black?
Full screen.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. Perfect, perfect. All right. Then I think we're good to go. All right, so really what we're going to talk about today, implementing the strategy. We're talking about implementing these new standards. And so what I thought I would do is just start with a little kind of reminder of where we all are. We're coming from all over the US. I had you guys chat that in already. And I think we all recognize that HIE is a worldwide problem. I mentioned that I've been all over the world really teaching about this topic, from Brazil to Thailand to, I just got back from the Middle East and in Oman, and I've been already before to Lebanon, and I'm going back to Brazil again this year. So this problem with HIE and asphyxia really is global, and it still is a leading cause of death in many places. And of course, we know the statistics of our own kind of modern world problem, but overall throughout the world, it's about a 23% cause of death for neonatal mortality. And really, we all recognize before cooling that HIE was, especially moderate encephalopathy, was associated with both risk of death as well as disability, and that we now know that cooling can support us. And we know through our multiple cooling trials and through the meta-analyses that have occurred that there is so much that we can do for these babies, and so much more that needs to be done. So providing cooling, I think, with, pardon the pun, is the tip of the iceberg in really what we're doing and providing. But we do know that cooling and hypothermia, under the way that we've studied it, does provide benefit to those babies who have moderate or severe encephalopathy. But we also know that it doesn't help everyone, and that's why the trials are continuing, and this really is an evolving therapy that we're offering, as well as continuing to define the populations as best as we can. So we know that because of the studies and because of the benefit, that there have been many organizations, AAP, ILCOR, and many publications discussing the benefits and the eligibility of patients. And we really still believe that the best benefit occurs to those infants who are treated before 6 hours of life, although we know that we have seen some modest benefit for those babies who are up to 24. But we know that it's not. We need to treat many more to find that benefit, and that we're not sure. The other kind of going question that's really hot and that's everywhere is whether or not to cool the mild HIE kids, and I think that this is always something that we want to talk about. So what we're really here today to do is to talk about this numbered letter that the California Children's Services, or CCS, as I will more commonly say, has created. I know there are some of you joining from other parts of the country, as well as I see some people joining from Germany and places. So I know that there are interest about this, but we're going to talk specifically about the guidelines that we have in California, because most of you are from California and are struggling with how to implement these and to make sure that you've done it well. So again, about 5 years ago, a group of clinicians started meeting together in San Francisco area, and we had a meeting called the Bay Area Cooling Summit. And this was a collaborative effort of neonatologists, neurologists, nurses, and over time, not only from the Bay Area, San Francisco area, but also from Southern California, began to kind of collaborate about the cooling practices that were happening in California. And with that, we realized that this was becoming a standard of care, that more and more units were providing cooling, that there was a huge interest in this, and the meeting continues on a couple times a year and is growing. And we were realizing that there were centers that were beginning to offer cooling that hadn't offered it during the clinical trials. And so we wanted to make sure that everyone was on the same page. And so I wanted to talk about a little bit about this pitfalls of translating research into practice. And there's an amazing article by Joan Smith. And if you've not read this article, I quote it a lot. And so Joan put out this paper, and she was a nurse practitioner that worked in St. Louis Children's Hospital and was really instrumental in them bringing their cooling program to the masses there. And she wrote this paper about translating research into appropriate clinical care. And if you've not read it, it's in the Journal of Perinatal and Neonatal Nursing. It is a really solid article that I think we can hang our hat on for about a lot of practices in the NICU. And it gives a really nice framework. In this paper, she talks about this idea of whether or not we underuse a particular therapy. So for example, do we not offer cooling to all of the right babies that should get it? Do sometimes we overuse a new treatment where we're so excited about it that we maybe offer it to babies that are not necessarily inside our criteria? So maybe we offer it to babies who are 20 hours old or 26 hours old now. Maybe we offer it to smaller babies. Maybe we offer it to babies that we didn't offer it to before. So there's this kind of desire, these mild babies, even is probably part of this discussion, is there's a desire to offer a therapy that works, but we don't exactly know all the populations it works in. So first there's underuse. Maybe we still don't cool all the babies we should. Then there's overuse, and then there is potential for misuse. And I think that we get in ourselves in this place of, well, cooling is benign and we should just offer it to everyone. But I think if you stop and really think about whether or not cooling is benign, certainly it requires hospitalization. Most of us don't feed babies, so it's 3 days minimum of being NPO. Most of the time, because of that, we put in lines. We definitely separate families. So I don't think that it is 100% benign, and I think that we should be cautious when we say, well, cooling is so easy and we should just offer it to everyone and it doesn't seem to harm. But I think when we use it outside of what it was intended, we push the envelope there. So I want to encourage you, and one of the things that CCS requires is quality improvement and quality assurance, and I'll go over some of the requirements there, because I think there is this potential for us to creep into other areas that haven't yet been studied. So again, overuse, underuse, and misuse. And certainly we want to make sure that we are appropriately using this kind of treatment. So back to our guidelines. So California Children's Services, or CCS, the numbered letter, it's available online if you've not downloaded it. I'm sure all of you CNSs have it posted on your walls and you're trying to check off all the boxes. It was adopted almost a little over a year ago. And so I know many of us are still struggling with full implementation. So let's go through what the requirements are, and then I'm going to give you an overview of some of the worksheets that I've created for you so that you can take them back to your hospitals and work on those. So program requirements: you have to be a CCS paneled NICU. That's pretty basic here in California. And you have to meet the AAP criteria for level 3. So these are sick babies, so they should be in places that can provide that kind of care. Number 2, you have to use a servo-regulated device. And although there were studies that were done and that are included in the meta-analysis, so Jacob's study, the ICE trial that was in Australia, New Zealand, Canada, and there was one center in the US that used ICE packs, the requirement for CCS is that you use a servo-regulated device. So there are still some head cooling devices in units in the US because they were sold while they were still available. They're currently not being sold here in the US, but outside the US, I know they're being sold. So selective head cooling is an option, but a very rare use here in California, I think especially. I think there's maybe 1 or 2 places that have a head cooling device still. So for the most part, we're all doing body cooling. And so body cooling is really the method or the technique that has really taken off for us. And of course, there are many different device makers for this as well. And so it doesn't really matter which device you use, just find a device, use it a lot, and get good at it. And if you're not using it a lot, you probably need to be doing drills, and we'll talk a little bit about some ideas around that. The other program requirement was that what we all believe, I think, is if you do something frequently enough, you'll do it well. And we were worried that if you didn't do cooling frequently enough, that your staff and your resources would be, it wouldn't justify the need for the extended resources that you have to have. And so looking at your program, you need to be thinking about whether or not there are enough patients in your area. So is your catchment area sufficient to have 6 treated patients per year? And this gets challenging, and if you look at our state, right, we have some very small, smaller counties, and then we have larger counties, and some of these counties are very densely populated and some are less populated, and some of them have many NICUs and some have few NICUs. So you really do have to know your population in your area, but these are the minimum requirements. And if you are going to be cooling less than 12 patients per year, then having a formal relationship with a regional center to make sure that you're staying up to date on changes in policies, changes in research, eligibility tools, and things like that. So these are just requirements that if you're not cooling this many babies, which would be about 1 a month, then you want to make sure that you have a plan in place for that. It doesn't mean you can't cool, and it doesn't mean that you can't have a program. It just means you have to have a plan, and that's really what I want to make sure that you go through. And these are averages, and it doesn't say how many years you have to average these over, but I think it's probably fair that a 3-year average is reasonable for the program requirements. So the other thing is you have to have a team, and they have to be an enthusiastic team because it takes a lot of effort to get this program going. And the CCS regs require at least a neonatologist, a pediatric neurologist, and a clinical nurse specialist be involved in this, but we know that there are many, many more involved in it. Some of the things that the team needs to do is to make sure that you have a clinical guideline. And I'm going to share with you the CPQCC toolkit in a bit. And that's really already gone through and really giving you some outlines. So if you don't have a clinical guideline, you don't have to start from scratch. They're already there. So the guidelines for your hospital that need to be adopted for your unit have to, have all of the things that you would expect. Who are you going to monitor? How are you going to, who are you going to cool? Who are you going to monitor? Who are you going to image and when? And how are you going to manage those patients? And you also have to have a QI and a QA program. It has to be documented, and you have to have the parameters that you're going to be looking at and how frequently, and especially reviewing any adverse events. And of course, the other piece is overseeing the training of all the providers. And that's really one of the things that I want to talk about today, is just some options that you have for getting this training done. The physician coverage, you have to have a neonatologist, kind of same as our usual CCS standards, and you have to have access to a pediatric neurologist. This pediatric neurologist has to be able to provide consultation at least by phone within 12 hours of the infant's life, to be able to consult on how things are going and whether or not you're cooling the appropriate infants. They have to be able to clinically assess the patient within 24 hours, ideally. It doesn't say mandatory or shall, it just says ideally in the regs. So I think if there are some telemedicine tools that you can use, these are going to be really useful tools if we're talking about our outlying remote places. And some of the role of this neurologist is to review the clinical assessments, to have review of the neuromonitoring and the neuroimaging, of course. So let's talk then a little bit about neuromonitoring, which is one of my favorite things to talk about. So the regs do require that there is the use of some sort of continuous monitoring. So this is monitoring during cooling and rewarming. And I know that people oftentimes have questioned this, and this is really based off of the American Clinical Neurophysiology Society guidelines, so the ACNS guidelines, which are available to download online. So continuous monitoring with some sort of monitoring. So it can be conventional video EEG, and some places do the first 24 hours are conventional EEG with video, then they transition to amplitude integrated EEG if there are no seizures. and then they may continue with conventional EEG, when rewarming begins. So, you can stratify this as long as there's some sort of continuous monitoring. And of course, we would all probably agree that if there's active seizures, the baby should continue on conventional video EEG. But I understand there are resource issues with some of this, and I think it's important that we at least acknowledge that, and that we are creative in this. There is not, in the regs, there is not an allowance for doing telemedicine, but there are services that can allow for that. And I think in some remote areas, I think that for neuromonitoring, that may be a solution we have to look at. Continuous EEG must at least be available during regular work hours. So you can use amplitude integrated EEG to get started, to hold you through, but you have to have some access to continuous video EEG during normal work hours. If you are monitoring with continuous EEG, it must be reviewed within 24 hours. And again, from my own personal bias, I really believe that this is why amplitude integrated EEG is so important, because if you only have continuous video EEG and it's only reviewed daily by someone, and 24 hours later, I think it's not enough. And I think it is not enough in real time, and then there's enough evidence to show that these babies frequently seize. More frequently, it's subclinical, and we definitely want to make sure that we are offering these babies the best chance. And we know that seizures on top of hypoxic injury creates much more injured brains. So we definitely, I think that this standard, although generous and realistic, is not enough, and that the standard to offer amplitude integrated EEG at some point continuously to your patients is really required. So if you're using AEEG and you're not only relying on the video EEG, it should be reviewed on an ongoing basis. This means that the people at the bedside must know how to read and look at AEEG. Not that they're experts and that they interpret and that they will write notes, but that the bedside providers, the nurses, your nurse practitioners, your fellows, whoever is on overnight knows how to recognize changes in AEEG, and that the AEEG tracing will be documented in the medical record if you are, and this is a requirement of CCS. So what are the available devices? Of course, there are full video EEGs that also have the amplitude integrated EEG trend embedded in them. There are standalone AEEG monitoring devices, and we're not going to talk about NIRS today, but certainly there is a trend towards using NIRS with many of our cooling babies. Literature supporting, expanding use of that, but the regs do not require this, mostly because we're really focusing on the seizures. So we really break it down into function and perfusion in this way, but really we're talking about brain function monitoring. AEEG can be learned, interpretation can be learned in a variety of ways. And this is the regs, this is all straight from the regs. The training can be done by a device representative and supplemented by an online course. You can attend neuromonitoring conferences and workshops, and there are many. And there are many coming up in 2018 and 19. I just came from the international one in Ireland, which will be in Florida in 2019. And you can also have experience through a training program. Oh, sorry for that typo. So I can't ever have a lecture without giving a little bit on AEEG and reminding everyone that there are really only 5 simple patterns, which I think makes our life, especially when we talk about HIE babies, there are really only 5 patterns to consider, and are very, very useful. And just as a reminder, AEEG is time compressed, and it's a very, very, very slow speed. And so you can see here on this pattern that we have our AEEG band, where we have 0 being no brain activity, 5 being kind of our minimum threshold for normal continuity, and then 10 is our upper margin limit, where we love to see brain activity exceeding 10 at all times for our babies. And we can visualize the lower margin drifting between continuous and discontinuous, or between 5 and less than 5 on this pattern, showing us sleep-wake cycling. And then remembering that it takes about 15 seconds to make one little line of AEEG. And so as we build this pattern over time, it takes about 40 of those little strokes to fill in 10 minutes. And then after another 10 minutes, we have a little bit of a pattern. And most people will not interpret less than 30 minutes of any tracing. But I think really, as you can see on this, this is a 3-hour tracing. You can really begin to see the pattern once you get several hours. So we're not talking about the beat-to-beat granularity of our EEG. We're really talking about brain function trending. So again, the speed is very slow. The standard speed, whether you're on, if you're on a standalone device, it's always preset at 6 centimeters per hour. But on our more complicated devices, our full EEGs, we can change the speed of the paper, and this changes the pattern. So you always want to make sure you set it to the 6 centimeters an hour. And this particular device shows about 3.5 hours, but most show about 3 to 4 hours per screen. So it's very slow, very time compressed. And then as a reminder, there are only 5 patterns. One is normal for our term babies. One is normal for our preterm babies, and is borderline acceptable for our cooling babies. And then the other 3 patterns are always abnormal and are predictive of poor outcome, especially if they persist. And so, so you need to be aware of those and how to read them. Neuroimaging is a integral part of our long-term assessment of these babies, and so you must have on-site MRI with diffusion-weighted imaging, or at least a way to provide this prior to discharge for all infants. So you may have a partnership with a hospital that you're connected to and things like that. We always want to provide this without sedation. We want to provide and complete our MRIs without sedation when at all possible. And there are several publications by the group from St. Louis, as well as the team from Boston, about how to do this and some techniques on providing sedation-free MRI. So mostly it's using those bean bags or the swaddle feed and scan kind of technique. And we want to make sure that, of course, that these are interpreted by neuroradiologists that have neonatal experience, and telemedicine support is allowable, and it's also listed in the guidelines. And so again, I hope you're just kind of taking notes and checking the boxes of all the things you have, or maybe these are some opportunities, some pieces of your program that are still kind of needing to be improved and kind of finalized. You have to have a mechanism to transfer to a higher level of care if you're a community level. So that would be for infants needing high frequency. If you don't provide that, INO. If you don't provide that, ECMO, because we know that a small percentage of these babies will have their PPHN worsened by the effects of cooling, and so we need to be prepared for that. And of course, then our transport team needs to have INO and those things available for us. Other reasons that we might need to transfer, and these are pretty similar to the things that we transfer out for in our regular CCS guidelines, would be things like enhanced care, ancillary testing, ethics consults, specialty inputs, and then of course, anytime that we feel like our staffing or the skill set that we need, we don't have at the place where we are. So anytime we need those, we can invoke that higher level of care. All infants who have received site hypothermia should also be followed up in the high-risk infant follow-up clinic. So you either need to have a relationship where you refer that or provide that locally. And then also there are 3 patient populations that must be referred for pediatric neurology follow-up. Those are babies who have had experience with seizures during their hospitalization. They are discharged on any anti-epileptics, or if they have confirmed brain injury on MRI. So according to the guidelines, this must be done, and this is one of the quality indicators that must be tracked as part of the requirements from the new numbered letter. And the thing I think that's causing most of us stress, and pretty much the longest part of the whole guideline, is really this idea that we need to provide 8 hours of training. And I'm going to share some exciting things that I have coming up for 2018, that if your hospital is needing help, then you'll be able to plug into that. So the guideline says nurses, nurse practitioners, and physicians must undergo 8 hours of training, that they have to gain an adequate background knowledge in the care of therapeutic hypothermia patients. They have done a very nice job of outlining in the guidelines all of the areas that need to be covered: pathophysiology, differential diagnosis, how does cooling provide neuroprotection, the mechanism by which that happens, understanding the screening, the identification, the use of the SARNAT or some other standardized neuro exam, making sure that those who need to do it feel comfortable with it. I know in a recent conversation with some nurses in San Diego, they are actually training nurses to do the SARNAT exam at 1 hour, 3 hour, and 5 hours for those babies who aren't a full, hard call. And the nurses are actually screening using the SARNAT exam, and they're training them and validating them because they don't want to miss any kids still in that window. And I think this is a really smart idea. And so these are nurses who are in newborn nurseries or who are in community level, level 1, level 2 nurseries that are not going to provide cooling, but the cooling center is going out and training these nurses to be ready to identify these babies and to help with getting them transferred readily. And I think this is a really smart and forward way of doing this, forward-thinking way of doing this, not just saying it's a one-time one-time exam. We know that the exam changes, it evolves. I think it's one of the most complicated parts of this choice of who to cool and who not to cool. And we know these babies fake us out sometimes. And so I know how complicated this is, but I think being creative and using these ideas of, really carefully monitoring these kids over that really critical first few hours to make sure we don't miss anybody. Of course, if you're going to be using AEEG, you have to have a way to train staff in the application and interpretation of it. There are many great tools out there that are coming, sensors that are making it easier for staff. They don't have to learn to measure. They don't have to scrub as much. Some places are using needles, some aren't. So application and interpretation of AEEG, really important. Identification of the seizures. Again, that's one of the primary reasons we're screening with brain monitoring, is to find those subclinical seizures, because we know that about 80% of those seizures are going to be subclinical for HIE kids. And so recognizing the clinical seizures when they show up, but again, they're so subtle and oftentimes subclinical. And everyone must know how to use the devices, troubleshooting them, and through all phases of cooling. There are some tweaks that you have to do to this device, no matter which device you have. So during induction, what is the safest way to use that? During the maintenance phase, if a baby falls out of range, what are your techniques to get them back in range? It's through all phases, and then rewarming has its own set of complications. So those are all important pieces that I think are really essential for not only the initial education, but ongoing, especially if you're in a catchment area where you're not getting as many babies and you're not meeting that 6 to 12 a year, then maybe these are things you would drill. These are things that you could include in your quarterly updates or annual updates, depending on really what you need to keep your staff competent. So in addition to these topics, we need to also remember all the things we already know about these babies. There are many non-neuro complications of HIE, and so they need some, very careful fluid management, glucose management. They have other multi-organ system failure that we have to manage, and so, making sure. And I always feel like this is the stuff we've all been doing for 20 years, 30 years, 40 years. We know how to manage babies with HIE, and so I always just remind people we've been doing this for a really long time. Cooling complicates some pieces of this, but we've all been doing this, and just reminding ourselves and making sure we have consistent standards about fluid management, glucose management, and those things. The other 3 bullet points that are on the right here are the additional ancillary services and topics of education that must be covered. When we are caring for these babies, and especially centers who have been shipping babies out to referral centers academic centers for research for the last 15 years. If you choose to have a cooling program, you're going to be keeping these babies in your hospital. And I think it's important to remember that before we cooled babies, many of these babies died. And even with cooling, some babies don't survive. And this, if you have been transporting these babies out of your unit, you have not seen those deaths, that 30% that may still pass away, that 10% that, whatever the percentage, I can't even remember the percentage right now, but you know what I'm saying. But those babies, you haven't had those babies in your unit. And when you bring them back into your unit, you have to have a way to support staff. This is what we're seeing time and time again, is that as we reintegrate cooling programs into units that have been shipping these babies, the nurses, the physicians, the care providers, we've forgotten how challenging these term babies who are perfect and are so sick, how distressing it is on staff. So making sure that we have good debriefing, that we have good spiritual care, palliative care for staff, for families, we need to have these in place. This has just been a lesson we've learned time and time again. And after the initial education, we have to keep up our competency. And so I think having a plan for that, whether that's part of, if you have a smaller unit, maybe everyone has to go through your competency. If it's a bigger unit, maybe you have a cooling team. So I think, of course, looking at your specific unit and your specific unit needs and your team and makeup, then deciding how are you going to do this. Is it going to be a separate skills day? Is it going to be a separate competency day that you have for those staff? Do you need it more frequently than annually if you're not getting enough exposure? And I think it's important when you think about your staff is think about the phases of cooling. There's the induction, there's the maintenance, and there's the rewarming. So induction may be as short as a few hours. The maintenance is typically that full 72 hours. And then your rewarming may be 6 hours, 12 hours, depending on how you choose to do rewarming in your unit. So the number of people who get experience with the initiation and the rewarming is a much smaller number than the nurses and care providers who get experience with the maintenance. We all get to see those maintenance kids, but it really is that initiation and the rewarming that I think in our retraining, we should really be focusing in on the troubleshooting that happens in that time. We should be thinking about, what in our own units have been the outlier patients. What are the things we need to do? Those big babies, right? Those 4.55 kilo babies, when you cannot get their temp down. Those babies who are not, kind of on the more mild, mild plus, the really low moderate kids, whose body fight cooling. We have challenges in induction. These big babies, septic babies, agitated babies, the NAS babies, those are babies that are really hard to get cool. They're hard to pull that temp down. So what are your strategies for that? Rewarming. When you have a hypovolemic kid and some, troubleshooting around rewarming and, having to restart pressors. And I think that those are all kind of scenarios that you could build into skills days, to simulation and other trainings that are more real life, not just pushing the buttons and showing that people know how to set the set point. I think that it needs to be more practical and more real life than that, because and again, if you can use examples from your own unit, I think it makes it even more meaningful. But I think really tracking, who in the last year has actually been on and helped to induce a baby, and who has helped rewarm a baby, and everybody else needs practice with that because they haven't done it lately. So again, just kind of thinking about the phases of the procedure and seeing who has done what. So how do you meet the requirements? I think we talked about it earlier. So the ways people can learn AEG, very similar. How are people learning how to care for babies with hypothermia? You can send your staff to conferences, and there are many, and I have a list of them at the end of this presentation so that you know where to send your staff. You can create local education, and this is where I think most of you who I've talked to in the last 6 months or a year since these came out, this is really where I think many of you are feeling the pain of this requirement, is because you're having to add this into an already overextended local education budget, time, resources on everything else that you're already doing. And so I think this is where many of you are struggling. So the third option is really to use online training tools, and there are some that are available already for you. So from me and from my companies, we have AEEG Coach. We offer free ebooks, free monthly case reviews and education. And we have a paid mastery course that I know some of you have brought your teams to before. Synapse Care is our conference company, and we have some free webinars, we have free quick start guides, and then this webinar today is being put on by them as well. And so with Synapse Care, we also created you the cooling workbook that I'm going to share with you here in just a minute. And then we have a conference for nurses that's coming up in February, and then we do on-site workshops. So we do offer a variety of things on-site and online. Starting in 2018, we're going to have a neonatal brain cooling club, and this is going to be an online on-demand seminar only about cooling. So when we looked at those 10 or 12 bullet points of things that we must document that our staff have had, this seminar is going to cover that for you. It's going to be an international faculty, and it's going to start in February of next year. It's going to be an opportunity to network with other cooling centers, share best practices, quality improvement projects, hoping that some of you will participate in this so that we can learn from each other. But really, we want to make sure that you know the latest in research and clinical care. And so that's what that's going to be about. And because you're on this webinar, you'll be receiving the first information about that when it comes live. And there's going to be some free parts of it as well. So if you need to fill in for your teams, there may be some pieces that work for you as well. So the lectures are going to be everything you need in the Brain Club to be CCS compliant, and we're going to do more. We're going to do case studies. We're going to talk about the bedside nursing care, and we're going to talk about cooling on transport, and we're going to have our experts from around the globe talking about those. So some of the websites that will help you and your team, if you haven't seen them before, the CPQCC, which is the California Perinatal Care Quality Care Consortium of California. I'm sure you're all cringing at me saying that. They have a toolkit on HIE, and so the link is here. I so rarely say CPQCC other than just say the letters together. If you haven't seen Courtney Westhoff's encephalopathy teaching videos, these are excellent tools. These are available for educational use only, but they will help your team to improve their skills on encephalopathy recognition. And there is an online textbook of MRI. If you've not seen that before, I put the link in here as well as in the workbook. So I wanted to make sure that you know that all of these are already available online and free for you to use. And there are many more. I mentioned before some of the ancillary support. So the guidelines also require that you have a developmental care team, that you have lactation support, and again, the palliative care, as I already mentioned, and then that spiritual care for staff and for family. If you're in a center that provides cooling and is a referral center, then there are requirements for you about the things that you need to be providing to your catchment area and to your referral centers. But every unit should have handouts for parents, culturally sensitive, right reading level handouts for parents. And there are some examples that UCSF have provided in the toolkit that I'm going to share with you as well. And quality improvement. So if you go back to the beginning, the whole reason that this numbered letter was created was that we wanted to make sure in California that we were providing quality care to our patients, that the right patients were getting referred at the right time, and that the cooling was done properly. I like to say that the temperature is the treatment. that is the dose. That is the medication we provide when we provide cooling. So just like if we provide too much med or not enough med, not providing cooling as it is intended is the same as providing the wrong dose. So when we have therapeutic ranges for some medications that we check because too much is toxic and not enough doesn't help. And cooling is the same. And it is really for us to be sure that we are providing quality care and that we want to make sure that we're looking at time to target temp. How many percentage of minutes is the baby in range and out of range? What are things we can do better? How fast are we getting brain monitoring started? How long are we doing video EEG? How many babies are having seizures? What babies are getting meds and getting the right doses and we're actually terminating seizures? All of these pieces are so critical. And this is really what the quality improvement is about. This is why the guidelines were made. Not to say that some units should cool and some units shouldn't. It's that there should be a standard of care for these babies with this critical injury that we do our best every single time. And the only way to ever improve is to measure what we do. And so I think that the guidelines have done a really nice job of saying this is what the standards are to provide the best care for these babies, but it's still really on us to look at our programs and to say, what can we do better? So let me just quickly go through some of the things that are in the standards. You can read them, monitoring your adherence to the protocols, minimizing your variations, as well as assessing short and long-term outcomes, percentage of kids who have bradycardia, those kind of things, right? There are some online tools, which I just mentioned, the HIE tools. And again, I just want to remind you that we're going to be opening up registration for the Brain Cooling Club coming up pretty soon. So you guys who are here today will be the first to know about it. And those of you watching the recording too, we won't leave you out. So let me quickly just switch over to see if there are any questions while I'm looking for the workbook that I'm going to email you guys today so that we can go through that as well. Any questions? I don't see anything popping up in the chat area, but feel free. While I switch the screens around here. No? All right. All right, so let me just stop sharing this so that I can switch to another screen here. So one of the things I'm going to send you is, okay, share screen. Click, click, click. Okay, so I'm hoping that you're seeing my Word document. If you can give me a little chat yes or something if you're still seeing it. I'm happy to send my slides, absolutely. Okay, so a couple questions. Let me, so Jennifer, your question is, why do all babies need MRI? So they need it at least by discharge, just because there are some, because we need to have discussions with families. The earlier that you can do the MRI, the better we can tell timing of injury. A little bit later is a little bit more helpful for MRI, for prognosis. Sedation for MRI carries risks, absolutely. So this is why sedation-free MRIs are a must. It's more for parent counseling than it is for anything else. There's not anything, after we finish cooling, there's not anything else we can do. If we've provided cooling, we've done the best we can, it's really for prognosis. And this is why the requirement is before discharge. If you do it early, you can have earlier conversations. And ultrasound is not enough. And MRI is really the gold standard for being able to see the extent of brain injury. And it correlates really powerfully with outcome. So So I'm with you. Sedation carries risk. This is why we have to, continue to work on the techniques of sedation-free. So Ruth is asking, would you put all babies on AEEG to rule out seizures or actively seizing? So AEEG is a screening tool. So you would put all babies who are eligible for cooling on AEEG, and they should have a full conventional EEG at some point, as long as you have that available, preferably in the first 24 hours. The earlier you can start AEEG, the better. Their seizures usually show up within that first 36 hours. So the earlier you can put those, the earlier you can put that on, the better, so that you can identify those seizures and terminate those seizures. So I hope that answers that. But, and the guidelines say, the ACNS guidelines say that any infant who is actively seizing should continue to be monitored with video EEG. So really, once you've identified them by screening with AEEG, as quickly as possible, transitioning them to a full EEG so that our neurologist colleagues can tell us more details about that. So you're talking about a baby who is not cooling but was seizing. Yes, absolutely, Ruth. So AEEG is a very powerful tool. So I think it's always important to know its limitations as well. So we know that AEEG will help us see about 80% of neonatal seizures. It's been validated time and time again, comparing its reliability and sensitivity to conventional EEG. It's about 80%. So it doesn't help. It doesn't catch them all, but that's the trade-off of so few electrodes. But when we place our AEEG leads over that central and parietal, or even frontal to parietal areas, that some people choose that montage, you're gonna catch really that high-risk zone. Most neonatal seizures do migrate through that central region, so by putting your electrodes over the central and parietal, you're gonna probably catch those highest yield seizures. Frontal lobe is very low yield for seizures, occipital as well. So GP, you mentioned the use of whole body cooling. I've come across, so I'm assuming WBC means whole body cooling, so I'm just wanting to clarify that question. I've come across a few that have qualifications but are marginal. Can you clarify that question? So you mentioned the use of whole body cooling. Will you please talk about that? So do you mean for a certain population? And then Ruth, would you need an order to place AEEG, or is it becoming standard of practice? It really depends on your hospital. There are some hospitals who make it a standing nursing order. So that would be if your hospital's done that. I think I would say the majority of places are doing it as an order. So it may be, you have a baby who's admitted for rule out seizures, and it's just a standing part of that order set. So you can definitely write it into order sets so that you're not having to ask. But there are certainly some nursing guidelines I've seen that allow for, at nurse discretion, to apply it, and then to get consultation. GP, I really want to answer your question. I think I'm missing a piece, I think. Are you meaning the use of AEEG on maybe borderline babies? I'm trying to infer maybe what you're meaning. Certainly AEEG itself, it has not been shown to be an entry criteria. It was used in the cool cap to help us figure out which were the most at-risk babies. And I think AEEG is an amazing tool. I think it provides a lot of value to us. I think that at the same time, it's not really been shown to help us with the, it's not a good entry criteria as of yet. But what it is good for is when you have these borderline babies, or I like to call them maybe babies. So if you have a maybe baby who comes into your unit and you have AEEG, And you can then put that on knowing that 80% of HIE seizures are typically subclinical. And if you find those seizures, that would be a definite indication to cool. Also, if you see any suppression of brain activity, disruptions of sleep-wake cycling, a more discontinuous pattern, I think that that can help push you over the edge towards cooling versus not cooling. And I've seen some hospitals create their protocol based on the NICHD criteria. And if the babies kind of fall out of that borderline, maybe baby situation, or you're kind of a no, but then you place AEG, kind of, I always like to say, like a tiebreaker, then you can use AEG, I think, really powerfully for babies who are in that zone. You see a nice normal pattern, you see sleep-wake cycling. I think probably all of us are going to feel pretty good about that. And we know that prediction of normal outcome is very strong for babies who have a normal tracing early. If you are monitoring kids with AEEG during cooling, just remembering that we want to see that transition back to normal pattern by about 48 hours. So that's really what the research is showing. There is a higher odds ratio of a poor outcome if you don't see sleep-wake cycling, if you don't see normal patterns. Even at the time of initiation of rewarming, the odds ratios for a bad outcome are still higher. So we really want to see that transition to a normal trace by that 48-hour window to give us the strongest predictor. I mean, of course, there's those kids who always blow our minds and do well, who have still yucky traces at 48 hours, but the percentages are against them for sure. So whole body cooling. The only thing I can say at this point is follow what are the published guidelines. I think this is an area where many are struggling. Again, we talked a little bit about, if cooling is so benign, why don't we just cool everybody? The studies that have been published with the thousands of babies were moderate to severe. We don't know if it will really help mild babies. We knew that cooling later might help some babies, and we did show for a very small percentage of babies it did improve outcome. So some places are choosing to do later. We found that deeper and longer didn't work. We're hopeful that maybe epogen might be an answer for some of these mild babies. We're also hoping it might be a solution to adjunct these more babies who just don't respond, the 6 of those 7 who don't respond. And the preemies, we don't know much about the preemies. So the 34 to the 35 and 6 kids, right? So that study is still ongoing on whether or not there's a benefit. So the mild kids are a huge question. And Alistair Gunn from New Zealand promised in the next 2 years that he will do some fetal sheep studies like he did for the initial moderate to severe. The problem is that the mild injury is much more difficult to define, and it's much more difficult to create. And so this is the complication that they're seeing as they're trying to design the animal models for this, is they're struggling. Like, how do we define what's a mild injury? How do you create it so that we can know that we're providing the right benefit consistently, so to the right kinds of kids? So anyways, I hope that's helpful. All right, so quickly I want to just show you. Can you see my screen? Can you give me a little quickie chat that you can see this as your logo here? I'm hoping. Otherwise, okay, cool, thank you. Okay, so what I did is I took the entire regs and I put it in a Word document for you. And this way, and I will email this to you guys. So you will be able to go through, and it has the section, and these numbers don't match exactly the sections, but I tried to put at least the sections there. That you would be able to say, are you a CCS paneled NICU? Are you using a device? And you could literally fill in the blanks about, what you're doing. So including your birth rates, everything. So I have all the sections. Who are your personnel? Do you have your plans in place for all the things we talked about? Who are your cooling team, your hypothermia team, from an administrative point of view, who is on your developmental care team, what is your lactation, so all the stuff we just talked about, your coverage, and then some of the QI stuff is kind of built in, you know, so does every baby get a neuro consultation within the first 12 hours of life? What's your percentage of on the phone versus in person? Your neuro monitoring, are all babies getting continuously monitored? What percentage is AEEG? What percentage is continuous video EEG? What's the age at initiation, right? Are they getting it on in that first kind of critical few hours of admission, or is it taking 12 hours? Just as a point of quality improvement, right? Just to know your numbers and be able to improve. Just documenting that you have your video EEG available, how often they're being reviewed, neuroimaging, what are your capacities to do, your capabilities, and how you're doing on your percentages, and higher level of care plan, your high risk follow-up plan, your training competency plan, your outreach services, and your quality improvement. So these are all just here in this document for you to to use so that you can fill it in. Okay, cool. Just make sure all these, and there's a question, so let me, okay. Just trying to clear all these. I see all that. Okay, so the other documents that I created in your workbook really quickly are, I'm hoping that you will be able to see all of these. Maybe if I open them up, that will be better, because then it will not switch screens on you. I'm hoping. So what I did is I made a education documentation. So again, all of those things that are listed for that are required, people might have attained education from a variety of different places. So you maybe went to a workshop here, or you did an online class here, or you've been in a webinar for this. And so this is a way that you could actually have your staff document that they've received all of this education. So these are just things that I made, just I thought might be helpful, so that you can kind of track everybody in your files. Maybe you can build these into your health stream or whatever else you're using. So, so I made that one. And then I also made for you an AEEG documentation. Again, since it's required, so you can have a way to track everybody. So how did everyone receive their training, device representative, online course, conference, and then the dates. And so you can have just your whole list, and you can put this in a spreadsheet or whatever to do that as well. So I wanted to make sure that you guys had that as well. I'm hoping these are coming through. Again, I should have my phone next to me so I can see that everything is coming through. And I think that is the end of what I prepared, but I'm happy to again spend time with you if you have questions or want to chat more about some of these things. Again, I was in on some of the meetings, but not on all of the meetings, so I can't speak to some of the rationale for all of the requirements, but happy to do my part to explain what I can, if I can. And again, just want to remind everyone that the Brain Cooling Club is going to be starting online in 2018, and would love to have your participation. And there will be group discounts, so if you want to have your whole staff attend, that would be awesome as well. So I'm finishing up all the contracts with all the speakers. I wish I could tell you all of the speakers, but I just promise you, you'll be so excited about them. They're really from all over the globe, and some of the leaders that we just don't get to see that often. So I'll turn my video back on. Ooh, it got sunny. So any final questions? I will package all this stuff up for you guys and shoot it out in an email. And appreciate you all being here. And if there are no questions, we'll all just head to lunch or dinner early. Ooh, that's really bright. Turn my video off.